This is WPSL Port St. Lucie, the talk of the Treasure Coast.
Fresh from China, it's Ask the Rabbi.
This is Rabbi Shafir Lobb of Congregation Eitz Chayim, and please feel free to give me a question. Please call in at 772-340-1590. And for those of you watching on Facebook, if you wonder why my eyes go up, it's because there are those numbers in front of me, and it's easier to make sure I do them correctly if I'm staring at them. I actually wrote my cell phone number down wrong for my students in one of my classes. If you get interrupted, you write down an old phone number. So somebody in Ohio somebody in Tucson, never mind.
They're answering questions of students.
Yeah, they're answering questions of students, trying to figure out what's going on. So
I gotta ask you, with everything that's going on with this virus, how are your Chinese kids?
Chinese kids are definitely talking about it, and they're calling it the virus, which is interesting. And they're saying things like, "Oh, this is much worse than the flu," so they're pretty savvy. School is out indefinitely until, quote unquote, it's under control. Yeah. Well, they would have been out for another week anyway, because they're out for 2 weeks for Chinese New Year. A couple of my students say, "Hey, I got some more time to get my homework done." Another one of my students, because it's called the biggest human migration, and a lot of students were already traveling to visit family when China put the travel ban inside the country. And so they're stuck where they are. And one of my students last night was actually complaining about not having her homework with her, and how she's got this game plan to get it done, because she knows that as soon as they lift the travel ban, it's only a couple of days until she's got to be back in school.
I didn't realize that region where they found that virus, that city, is so large.
Yeah, well, there's
8 million people.
Yeah, China's huge, and that's kind of an interesting piece. There are more Chinese than there are almost anything else of one type or another. There are many ethnicities within the Chinese people. There are many religions, even though the government itself is communist and not religious by definition. Right, but there's a lot of very old, steeped religion, and some of it's just traditions. Chinese New Year. Right, that's rooted in ancestral relationship, ancestor worship kind of. It doesn't mean you think your ancestors are God, but it means that you still think that you can connect with them. And so there's this idea that ancestors pass on wisdom through some form of communication. And, gee, that doesn't sound all that different from other things that other people...
No,
it's not. It seems that most indigenous religions or old-time religions have that feeling in them that ancestors know more, and that they've passed it down, and that they continue to pass it down in one way or another. And so, I think it's really interesting that we've got such a huge, huge chunk of humanity, and most American students don't really even know that it's a country. And they certainly do not know anything about any of the cultural backgrounds. They don't really know who Confucius was. They don't know who Buddha was. They don't know any of these folks, and they've got this kind of weird idea that Buddha's God. No, Buddha's Buddha. It's an enlightened individual human. He actually gets more
kind
divine,
of like a prophet in a way.
yeah, much
maybe?
more a teacher, a prophet.
Teacher. Yeah.
Yeah. Most religious leaders are teachers in one way or another. They're trying to teach people to lead a better life. And, it gets couched in an assorted set of languages and terms. And, the big thing, if you had asked Confucius what he was teaching according to him, according to the writings of his followers, not according to him, but according to the writings of his followers, he was out to teach what he called virtue. And what most people don't get when they look at him, they look that he talks about being submissive and obedient to the leader, but he's not so much preaching that as he is preaching to the leaders to be chunzi, to be the best human beings they can be. And,
there's a lot that can be said to
there's
that
a
everywhere.
lot, absolutely. And he's a government official when his father has died, his mother dies when he's not very old. He has schooled himself in music and art and all of the classics. He's actually a very rounded intellectual. And he's working as a government official. And there's a wonderful scene in the life of, there's varieties of lives of Confucius, where the people come to him because he's a government official and complain that the taxes are just too high. And, they traditionally are most places. And so he goes to the ruler, to the warlord, basically, and says to him, you're taxing the people too high. They can't pay it. And the guy gets angry and says, if they can't pay it, then let them watch out because I'm going to take even more. Typical, that kind of response. And, the ego response. And Confucius says, no, listen a minute. If you lower their taxes, they will be so happy and so grateful that they will work harder and they'll be more productive because they'll be able to keep more. But the smaller amount that you tax them, if they're more productive, will end up in more in your coffers than if you're taxing them too high and stifling their productivity, which is a very enlightened way to approach it. And the leader sees that. He says, you're shrewd. You're very shrewd, Kung Chu. Put that into practice. And so he becomes this administrator. And he gets the name wise teacher. He starts teaching. And he teaches that, you need to stay rooted in the traditions. You need to stay connected to your rituals. So he's not everybody says that he's not a theist. That's not the point. He's not talking about how you worship God. He's talking about how you deal with people. But he's saying, you need to stay steeped in your traditions. You don't violate them. You stay rooted in who you are so your identity is intact. We would couch it in different words today, but that's what he's teaching.
Makes perfect sense.
It makes perfect sense. Now, because their tradition is much more rigid and the society is not as mobile, it has influenced China even to today. When the communists took over, they wanted to get rid of everything, quote unquote, that was old, and Confucius fell into that category. But they really just ended up renaming it, and it's still done the way that Confucius taught. And so, there's this interesting piece that it's still there.
They at least did not do what ISIS did and wipe out the historical sites.
That's the real the Zoroastrian sites in particular that are being destroyed. It's just and people are short-lived in their memories. People don't really get it. Zoroastrianism is where we get heaven and hell and children of light and the children of darkness. It's not surprising that there were scrolls talking to that in Qumran, because it would have come up and down the Silk Road. So one of the things that I often hear from people, I'm going to take a left turn, not surprisingly, because I always do. And sometimes people will say to me, well, what kind of a religious person are you? And the answer is one who's aware of how things have influenced, right? It's not this non-thinking, blind, oh, somebody told me this is what it says, so I'm going to believe it. First of all, I go and check texts, number one. Number two, and this is my personal philosophy. If you have to use something really off the wall and weird to explain it, you probably don't have the right explanation. Right? The answer is probably much more reasonable, much more rational, much more natural.
Sure.
So, and just because Scripture says it doesn't mean it's not a story. We often use stories to illustrate. I was kind of blown away when I first started really, really digging into my specialty, which is 1st and 2nd century Judea. So it's the interaction of when Judea loses its independence and becomes a Roman vassal. It's that transition, and it was not a gentle one. It took a couple hundred years to make it really take seat. It didn't happen overnight, which a lot of people like to think that it did. It was, and with 20/20 hindsight, you look back and of course Rome was going to take over. Of course Rome was going to. They're taking over all over anyway, and it wasn't the first time that it happened. That had happened under Alexander the Great. That's why he's called great, because he was able to exert Greek influence all over most of what was then, quote unquote, the known world, which went all the way toward China and Europe and Egypt. So it kind of encompassed that land bridge area.
I have to ask you about the news item this week that President Trump introduced a two-state solution with Palestine. And you're staring at me. It's he and Netanyahu.
Yes.
I know you're not a fan of either.
Well, one does not need to be a fan of the person sitting in the middle of the government to be a fan of the country. It's one of the people. Okay, so I'm going to take the left turn here again. Some people love Israel so much that everything that Israel does, regardless of who's in power, is right. Other people love Israel so much that they want everything that it does to be right or righteous. Right? Both are love. Both are wanting the best for the country. It's just two different sides, two different approaches.
Yeah.
And I confess that I fall into the idea that if you're going to do it in the name of Jews, then it needs to be righteous.
Could a two-state solution work?
I think a two-state solution has to work. There are far too many people invested, and this may get me who knows what. There are far too many people invested financially, emotionally, spiritually, with everything else in keeping the conflict volatile in Israel. They want to keep people fighting. They want to have this Armageddon kind of blow up. And there's this other little, there's a group of people who say, all the Jews have to go to Israel so that we can force God's hand and bring the rapture, right? There's all kinds of really off-the-wall stuff. And, first of all, I don't think that's ever going to really happen. I can't picture every Jew wanting to leave where they live.
Well, Hamas wants to just totally destroy everything, at least in their.
And again, you've got a lot of sub rosa, right? You've got a lot of things below the public level, for lack of a better word, that's invested among other things, here's something that Israel, with the conflict and the rest of the Middle East and all of that, it's a wonderful proving ground for ammunition and weapons.
Oh, brother.
Okay, it's a lab. And as long as you can keep people shooting at each other, you've got a place to field test your weapons.
Oh, God.
Yeah. How's that for a cynical approach? Okay.
The military establishment. That's, oh,
Well,
man.
it's not the military per se. It's the folks who supply the arms to the military.
Okay.
Okay, there's a difference. The military, as a veteran, as somebody who's coming out of having served, and yes, it might have been Kool-Aid, but in general, the idea of most militaries is really not to fight. Right? Is really to train and be ready, but not to actually do it.
Right.
I don't think there's anybody who doesn't think that warfare in the trenches is horrible. It's horrible for the soldiers and the sailors and the airmen and the corpsmen. Nobody really likes that. There might be an adrenaline rush for a brief period, assuming you survive. But the cost of war socially is just so high. So high. You're dealing with PTSDs, you're dealing with all kinds of issues when you try to reintegrate the folks coming back because of the extremes of what they've been exposed to and the horrors that they've seen. And
I know Netanyahu was saying that that the average Palestinian is just tired of Hamas.
Well, Hamas
trying to foment
yeah.
things.
Originally, Hamas served kind of the social network things. They provided hospitals and the social stuff, and that's really how they came to power. But then it turned, and folks that got benefits out of being in positions of power have done everything they can to stay there. And there's this whole economic undercurrent that nobody talks about. It's the elephant in the room. And you really, on both sides, need to go down and see who's making money doing what. Because there's a lot under the table all over the place. And the game that's played in the public arena is very different from the money that travels under the table.
Wow, that's amazing.
And that's true. There's not a government that I know of, ours included, where there isn't stuff going on, and some of it's kind of there, and people kind of like look aside and say, well, either they're consciously deciding not to be aware, or sometimes I'm in shock at what we allow as a people to happen. But most people, here we go with generalizations, and I'll probably get shot for this one. But feel free to give me a call and let's talk about it. 772-340-1590. Did not mean to get political. Thank you so much, Greg. But, so we hear about things like, so let's take President Trump, right? The cost of his trips and the amount of money coming into various facilities and the expenses to the cities for providing all of the security for him.
Oh, sure.
There's a ton of money, and there are people who are really benefiting from that. Are they wrong to benefit from it? Well, if it's going to happen anyway, there's nothing, somebody might as well benefit from it. The problem is that the people who benefit from it then want to keep it that way. And it's been an ongoing challenge. Yeah. There's a monetary value in keeping the Middle East hot. And I guess that's the best way I can put it. And
always comes down to money.
It always does come down. It's always been money. Even on the Silk Road, it was all about trade. It's always been. Money is shorthand for power. Right? People who are rich are more powerful and certainly believe they are. And that's why a lot of people pretend to be rich, right, so that they can exert some of that. And then others, quote unquote, put on airs and things like that. That's all about power. Right? Money's a shorthand for power. So coming back to the whole thing, China is very aware of the issues that they've got. Their people are aware of it. The students are aware. They're not going anywhere. They're staying in their homes, trying to control this virus. And I'll give that to them. That's where their obedience, their civil obedience. I think back. Look at how Japan responded to the tsunami. That was devastating, right? There was no looting. There was no law breaking. There was an orderly society trying to set itself back up.
Right.
Nobody was really taking advantage of it. And I kind of see the same attitude with the Chinese as reflected by my students, by what they're saying. Because we always have a couple of minutes of what is called casual conversation. And I'm open enough, especially with my advanced students, where I say to them, what do you want to talk about? Right? What's important to you today? What questions do you have for me? And some of them have even asked me, do you have the virus there? Do you know about the virus that we have? And my answer to them is, we've had a couple of cases, and people are trying to contain it, and they even say WHO, right, World Health Organization.
Sure.
They know those words.
So they know the WHO.
They know those things.
Even as a kid. Okay.
Right. So, it's... And I'm not saying that I've got the answers, and I'm not putting myself up to rule the world by any stretch of any imagination. I wouldn't want any of those jobs for anything. Not for anything. I've got enough tension in my life trying to keep my little flock in where it needs to be, with whatever guidance I can offer them. And and my students here. But I think that, so here's one of the reasons why I enjoy my teaching of the Chinese students, even though it's got some pains associated with the hours because they're 13 hours apart right now. And that is that I think it's important for them to have a good relationship with a non-Asian, and for them to have this idea that as a teacher, whites can be trusted. And I know that I represent America and white faces to them. And so, I want to be as considerate. So in my broken Chinese, which is very, very, I do not speak, more than 2 words in Chinese. But, I've gone out of my way, for example, to learn to say Chen Yan Kuei Lu, Happy New Year. Right? And I've sat there with it, and it probably still sounds like this, but the students respond to it. So I know that I'm close enough that I'm not offending them. And that's a serious thing, right? When you're trying to do somebody else's religion or somebody else's language, until you become proficient in their pronunciation, you can really butcher something. So trying to sound like you know what you're doing, and I know better than to say hello, because so many ways to mangle that one. You would think that wouldn't be, but
I would think that would be really simple.
Yeah. So I consider that part of what I'm doing is counteracting the built-in prejudice that they might have otherwise if they didn't get to know somebody. And so that's another topic. That's actually what I was going to work on. I was going to work a little bit on privilege and on biases. And, we don't even realize how much we take advantage of our own privilege, whether it's white, it's American, it's male, it's female, it's Christian, it's Jewish. We had it's an interesting thing. There are a lot of unaffiliated Jews in the Treasure Coast. And if you're any of those folks, please do consider checking us out as a congregation.
What do you mean by
unaffiliated? Yeah. People who don't really go out of their way to mention that they're Jewish. They don't belong to a congregation.
Oh, okay.
They're not.
Gotcha.
They're not actively Jewish. There's so many things to do, that are thank you, Al. I'm getting some comments here. And straight and gay and and again, just because you're part of a minority doesn't mean you're not prejudiced as much as anybody else. Just because you're part of a group doesn't mean you're not prejudiced or taking advantage of your power position. It was one of the interesting things. When I spent a year in Israel, I was told that they have WASPs too. White Anglo, Sabra with Protexia. So there is some class issues going on in Israel that, again, are for the most part not talked about, but that are really social issues that need to be dealt with. It's a real country with all of the real country problems. They've got prostitution, they've got crime, they've got sewers, they've got everything that everybody else has. There's this, Americans want to have this ideal that it's some God-promised land. No, it's a real country with real country issues, with real, administrative issues of potholes and bank robbers and all those other things.
I would think, though, less of that, just simply because of the discipline, like, the ladies going into the military, that kind of a thing.
But see, okay, ladies going into the military, they're not equal with the men. That's the piece that's not mentioned.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
All right. Just like women can go in the military in the U.S., but for the most part, it's not equal. It's getting better. Right? When I first was in the military, women were not allowed in combat.
Right.
Right. 'Cause we're going to protect them.
Right.
Well, that sounds wonderful and noble until you realize that automatically shuts them off from leadership positions. Because leadership positions in the military go to people with combat experience.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So you've automatically cut out all of the women that were serving during the time when they couldn't have combat. Could they become the head of the nurses? Yeah, they could become some leader of a small group, of a support group, but they could never really be considered, part of that.
That's interesting.
Okay. So those are really subtle things. And, it becomes the issue too with you have to control for stuff like that when you're looking at all different kinds of studies. That's the glass ceiling, right, that people talk about. You can only go so high because you don't have the pieces, right? And it was used early on in the military to keep blacks down. Now, obviously, some of that has gone away, and we continue to get better and better and better. But some of that's taking back and looking back. What do we really mean when we say all men are created equal? Right? We have to look at what the definition of man was when those words were written, and decide if that's the definition that we really want, if we want to be a world leader.
Getting back to the military was so cool at the Rose Bowl. You see the stealth bomber fly over, and it was a woman pilot, and that she was the first lady flying those big birds, and it was like, this is cool.
Yeah.
It's about time,
Yeah. Well, it is. There's, one of the arguments, I'm short. I used to be 5'2". I'm not sure how tall I am anymore. I think I'm shrinking every minute right now. But when I was in the military, they were just starting to open up flying to women. And I flew in civilian. I was a flight instructor on the side. And so I knew very well how well I fit or didn't fit into an airplane. And this is a perfect example of the kind of discrimination, built-in systemic discrimination that I'm talking about. Women actually, because of the curvature of the spine, sit differently than men. And there's a curve in women's spines to handle childbirth, because you have to have something to give when the baby's there.
Sure.
And so it kind of makes sense. Men don't usually have that curve. And so when you sit, that curve opens up and you sit a little taller than a guy who's the same, who if he had the same legs as you do and the same trunk height, you would sit just a hair higher. And that's just the spine unfolding. All other things being equal, and of course any two people may or may not be, with all of those caveats. And so you had to be I was either 5'3" or 5'4". I forget what it was. It was something like, it was just a little bit taller than I was to get into the military flying program. And there was a waiver at 5'3", and you were supposed to be 5'4". That's what it was. I'd have to think back. And I took myself down to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and actually had them measure me in the cockpit to show that I could reach all the pedals, I could reach the knobs, I could do all the things in the existing aircraft, which you can do in a simulator. You can do it without any big problem. You can be measured and checked. And I had enough force. I had all of the pieces that were needed to be safe in an airplane. And the proof of it is that women fly today, and some of them are short. Yeah. And but at the time, what I was told is, well, that's the requirement, that everybody has to be 5'4", and it's applied equally to men and women, so it's not a problem. It's not discrimination. It's a built-in discrimination, because many women are under 5, or certainly then were under 5'4". Fewer today, but there are still short women, and there are more short women than men.
In talking with some of the pilots at the Stewart Air Show, they were saying that there now were a lot more women helicopter pilots in the military.
Yeah, well, because they got opened into the combat.
Sure.
And that made a big change. Right, like if you're flying medevac, you're not going to get shot at.
In theory.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sure. Not that any doctors or paramedics have not been shot down wherever. Civilian aircraft get shot down. Right?
Sure.
So you can end up just as dead as somebody who's in combat. But the other part about this requirement, as I was, and I was so infuriated about it, is my argument was not that the law was applied improperly, but that the law needed to, or the reg needed to be looked at. Because among other things, it didn't say that you fit or didn't fit into the cockpit. The other piece of that was that I knew from other things that the aircraft manufacturers didn't size their airplanes to the 5'4", because foreign pilots to whom they knew they would sell the airplanes eventually are shorter.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Right, and so they made the cockpits fit for smaller people. So there's a huge argument to say that reg needed to be looked at, and that the reg was discriminatory. Not that it was being applied discriminatorily, but that the reg itself was systemically.
So they couldn't look at your individual civilian flying record for years.
Right. To determine that I was safe or not safe in an airplane.
That makes no sense.
Of course not, but, a reg's a reg. And, I tried to fight the battle. I tried to even get a senator involved. And basically the answer from the senator was, it's applied equally to men and women. It's not discrimination. It's like, you're sidestepping the whole issue. The issue is whether or not I'm safe in an airplane, and therefore should be able to get into it. And what was ironic about it is that one of the navigators, and navigators are an interesting group. This navigator was vehemently opposed to women flying. Why? Because the pilot's in charge of the airplane. And he even said he would be danged if he would take orders from a woman.
Oh.
Yeah.
He actually said that?
He actually said that, and he said it in the cafeteria at me.
Stupid.
Yeah, well, I didn't pursue it because there wasn't any point in it. But I laughed hysterically about 2 years later because I happened to find out that this particular individual's daughter wanted to become a pilot.
Oh, I love it.
And so he was then fighting the same thing because she was right on that edge of the height. She was between 5'2" and 5'3". and he was leading the merry fight to say that things weren't fair. And
Oh,
I,
boy.
it was too late for me.
That's hysterical.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, the old what goes around comes
Yeah,
around.
it's. What can I say? We all work from, but I guess he figured he'd never take orders from his daughter, so it was probably okay. I'm not even going to go there.
Oh, my. Yeah.
So, the joys of life. And we often judge what's fair and not fair based on the things that we want. That's really what fair is used as a kludge against things to get what you do or don't want. I think the noble person fights for what's fair when they either get no benefit out of it or when they even are willing to take something that may put them in a lesser position just because it is what's right.
Mm-hmm.
And as I like to tell people, it's more important to do what's right than to be recognized as right. And that's really, to me, the bottom line. It's do we do what honors all human beings, regardless of ethnicity, of training, etc. And to bring it back around full circle, we do not teach our kids in school about most of the world. We don't teach.
Oh, yeah.
Right. We don't teach the average American child coming through grade school the history of the world. We teach them the history of Christian Europe. And, I understand that the shrinking majority of people in America are Christian. That is definitely on the way down. It had reached a high in the 70s, 70-some percent a few decades ago, and it's definitely on the way down.
I know my cousins, my uncle was a Navy guy, and he was all over the world, and they were in Japan for about 10 years. And their eyes were open to such a degree because, they didn't know anything.
Yeah, they saw the world
About
from a very,
Japan.
yeah. Well, and there's so many things Americans come across extremely loud and brash and not cultured in the Japanese environment. We don't understand, as a rule, Americans think that the whole world should be like our society is, and it's not. Right? There are things that we would find offensive that they don't see any problem with. Conversely, there's lots of things that we do that are offensive to them. And are we responsible? That's another good question, right? Are we responsible for the things that we do that offend somebody? And I would have to argue that we are. That's a function of getting to know somebody. If you know somebody and you care about them, you care about what offends them. So it's cavalier to say, well, I did it and it's right by me, so if you don't like it, tough noogies. You take offense, I don't give it. That's not entirely true. We do things that offend and hurt people, and I think we have an obligation to learn about those things, evaluate them, and see if we have a choice that doesn't hurt or offend. And is it a constant hard work kind of thing? Yeah, it is. There's a concept in Judaism called lashon hara, an evil tongue. Right? So the tongue that hurts somebody. And it's often unintended consequences. But Jewishly, you're still liable. Right? So if you harm somebody, you have a responsibility to undo that harm to the best of what you can. I'm not saying, go and hurt yourself, but, take your ego down a notch or three. Apologize, make restitution. Do what's right instead of getting on a huffy horse. An example of a lashon hara that a lot of people don't think about. we're in a room of 20 people, and I single one out and say, hey, I really like the outfit you're wearing. That's nice. Now, that makes that person feel good. But, somebody else may have really struggled to put their wardrobe together that day. And they go, I must not have done a good job. Right? So you've, without realizing it, you've hurt them. And so what I'm saying is that there needs to be some sensitivity to what's going on, the unintended consequences. Are you going to mess up? Oh, yeah, all the time. People are going to mess up and hurt others. Be open to being aware of that. You're not responsible for what's going on in their life, but you are responsible for where you touch it. And, and so the apology is not, I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry, that my words were hurting to you. You weren't bad. Your behavior may have done something. We need to separate that kind of thing. Now, does that mean that you bow over backwards to the high maintenance people? Not in general. There's a responsibility to help them move as well. This is not, there are no perfect answers. There are no easy black and whites or cut and dry or, red and green or whatever, however we want to describe it, purple and yellow. I'll go to whatever opposites we want to consider, and that's using the pigment color wheel and not the light color wheel that more kids are learning today. Mm-hmm. And, so it's looking at those things. It's back to Chinese. It's the yin-yang, right? Taoism. It's seeing opposites, but recognizing that everyone's got a little bit of the other in them. We're all a mix.
Ooh, that's neat.
Yeah. If you look at the yin-yang circle, which a lot of people don't realize comes out of Taoism, Chinese cultural religion, no matter how you slice that circle, you're going to have some of each opposite in it.
Wait a minute, back up.
Okay, so that black and white circle thing that looks kind of like, I don't know, teardrops against each other spinning. And what a Taoist would point out to you is the only part that doesn't move is the very center. The infinitesimally small center of that wheel is the still point of the Tao. But as that circle rotates, which is the story of life, good is followed by bad, is followed by good, is followed by bad. Life is an ongoing back and forth, but there's always some good in the bad and some bad in the good. Okay, so that's using good and bad. There's some high in the low and some low in the high. There's some sweet in the sour, some sour in the sweet. Right? We're never 100% of anything. There's always some amount of the other. And so that's represented by however you would slice that circle. If you cut through the center point, you're going to have some of each of the opposites. And the Taoist points out there really isn't. We can't get to absolute zero temperature. And so hot and cold, as my husband often points out, my hot is excruciatingly hot for him, and my cold is warm to him. And so we're constantly having this discussion about what's hot and what's cold. Because our reference points, our middle points are different. And where you view any subject is a function of where your reference point is.
It's funny, you talk about that, and one of my camera guys in L.A. for ESPN was Canadian.
Yeah.
He knew more U.S. history
than most Americans.
Than we did. And, you'd sit there, you get into a conversation with him and going, where'd you learn that? Winnipeg.
In school.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay.
Well, we have really, really missed a couple of boats with the American system that has ended up teaching the test.
Yeah.
We have really stopped our students from learning how to learn. Most of them, what they do, and I teach a course that's designed to combat that. It's philosophy, critical thinking, ethics. Those are all things that ask you to step back and think about how you're thinking. Learn how to be logical, how to recognize fallacies, and I'm looking forward to it now. One of my my ethics class has an assignment called the politician's paper.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. So they've been learning fallacies and logic and how to make sure that an argument follows. And the politician's paper, they have to take a Democrat and a Republican. And I have ruled out no prior candidates, so we're not going to, it's got to be a current candidate. And I've excluded President Trump just because, among other things, there's too many YouTubes out there that already look at the fallacies in his speeches and stuff. So I don't want them to have that shortcut. That's the big reason for doing it. There's just too much out there. And so they have to pick a current Republican and a Democrat, and they have to find at least 3 fallacies in their public statements or a speech or something, that I can see the actual original text. And at the end of the paper, the criteria is I cannot tell if you are a Republican or a Democrat.
Sure.
And, as I point out to them, every politician uses fallacies because most people do. Well, all people use fallacies, especially public speakers, especially anybody with an agenda. When they run out of logical arguments, they end up going into fallacies. The emotional, the side tip, the student wanting me to regrade a paper. Sometimes you run out of logical reasons and you end up getting into the fallacy end of the world.
Is that because you made a mistake grading the paper?
And I'm perfectly capable of making a mistake grading a paper. And I do look at papers again if a student questions something. Usually we end up, the way that I do papers is they have a chance to turn it in, get it critiqued, and then they can submit a final submission. So they've got a chance to really work at it. And as I tell the students, it's not because I'm trying to, not because I want a snapshot. I'm not into snapshots. I'm not trying to trick them. I'm not trying to flunk anybody out of the class. I want people to learn. And the best way to learn is through an iterative process where you do something, you get feedback, you do it again. And so their big paper, the politicians, is a small paper. It's just a fun exercise in fallacies because it's so ripe. The other area that's really ripe is advertising.
Say, so easy now.
It's so easy. And advertising is really easy. And part of the reason why politicians and advertising is because they're really doing the same thing. They're trying to sell something. And, that lends itself to fallacies, particularly when you run out of logical arguments. And this is as good a point as any to mention something I have been forgetting, speaking about selling. If you would like to sponsor an episode of Ask a Rabbi, please consider doing that. It would be a great help. It would help me continue to bring this Ask a Rabbi to the Treasure Coast and everywhere else that people listen to it on Google Home and Alexa. Wherever you're listening, whether you're listening on Facebook and all of that, please do consider sponsoring. You can either contact me by Facebook, by telephone. The phone number is on the congregational website and on Facebook. Or you can call the radio station. You can call that 772-340-1590 and tell them you'd like to sponsor one or more episodes of Ask a Rabbi. I would really love that. A thank you to Sally Lloyd, who did that for us, and looking for some more sponsors if we could find them, please. That's my pitch.
Yeah.
So if you like listening in, please consider. You don't even have to sponsor the whole hour; just sponsor a part of it, and that would be great. If enough people do that, then I'll be able to continue doing Ask a Rabbi.
There you go.
Yeah. Thank you. And so, and then I do need to mention we've got a big public event coming on this Sunday. And people have told me, yes, it's Super Bowl Sunday. I know that. But the Four Chaplains has been on this Sunday forever, ever since they started remembering it. And that is, so the Four Chaplains is at the Community Center on Oroso. I forget the number of the street, but it's not hard to find. It's right across from City Hall. And if you're on Port St. Lucie Boulevard, it's just north of that. You make a left on Oroso, and it's on your right. Lots of parking there. There's parking across the street as well. We're in the back of the main hall. with where the stage is for those who know. It's the four chaplains. It's sponsored mutually by different congregations in the area, and it remembers the four chaplains who served on the Dorchester and went down with the ship, giving up their own life vests, their own jackets, their own gloves to go down because there weren't enough of all of those when the ship was sunk. And if you'd like to hear the story about those four men and how they linked arms and regardless of faith tradition, prayed and sang and gave of themselves, gave the ultimate gift to some sailors and to some Marines that were on that ship. It's the Dorchester. It's at 3 o'clock at the community center. Please join us. It's open to the public, and everyone is welcome. So please do that. And on the ship there was a Catholic, there was a Jew, there was a Dutch Reformed, and a Methodist. I believe that's the traditions that are there. So you'll hear about it. There's a great film that they're going to be showing, and we'll learn some more about the Dorchester. But we do this every year in Port St. Lucie. We remember the four chaplains.
That's nice.
Yeah. It's an important part of our American history, of our American heritage, and it's how the faiths work together.
Again, it's a lot of history that's being lost.
Yeah, people are forgetting about things like that, and so please do consider joining us. If you don't join us, please check out the four chaplains. You can Google it. You can Google the Dorchester and find out about that. We did have one of the survivors actually living in Fort Pierce, or Vero, somewhere just north of well, it's not north of the station. The station's in Fort Pierce, but north of me, because I'm in Port St. Lucie. So here we are, and this is the very close end. If you've got one last question, you might be able to sneak in at 772-340-1590. And we have been talking about all different kinds of things. We've got 2 more minutes, so that's as good a thing as to mention. We've got Tu B'Shvat coming up, the Jewish New Year of the Trees. That'll be in February. I'll talk more about that after the four chaplains. But that's the anniversary of trees. We've got 2 little citrus trees out in front of our congregation right now. And there'll be a third very soon. So that's Arbor Day for Jews, if you will. And then followed by Purim, and then Passover is coming. So lots of Jewish stuff coming up soon. You can join us any Friday night at 7:30. We do services open to all. You're welcome, whether you're Jewish or not. Maybe you just want to check it out. 7:30, and we're at 540 Northwest University Boulevard, Suite 102. It's a blue building. We're the front building, and we're right next to the elevator. Please feel free to join us, or Shabbat morning at 10:30 in the morning. We have services. So all of those things. This is Rabbi Shafir Lobb, and this has been Ask a Rabbi.
What's your phone number at the temple?
You would ask that.
Oh no! I threw a curveball?
You threw a curveball, yeah. It's 772, I think it's 934-4110. Yeah.
Cliff's guy.
I had to think about it. 934-4110. Please feel free to give us a call or come and see us.
Have a good day. Have a good week.
You too. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Have a great week. See you next week at Ask a Rabbi, right here on WPSL.
This is WPSL, Port St. Lucie, Talk of the Treasure Coast, webcaster to the world.